In 1545, the Mary Rose sank off the southern coast of England. In 1982, she was raised from the sea for the first time in 400 years. Among the hundreds of artifacts on board were 172 English longbows. Why was it that during the Middle Ages, English and Welsh longbowmen were so dominant on battlefields, and what brought it to an end? As England conquered Wales in the 12th and 13th centuries, the Welsh archers were able to use longbows to pierce armour and bring down the famous Norman knights. The English didn't forget this, and the longbow was quickly adopted across England. A perfect longbow would be made from a yew tree. Half would be made from the outer sapwood, and half would be made from the inner hardwood. Longbows were almost always taller than the archer that was using them. The piece of wood that would become the longbow had to dry for at least a year and be slowly worked into shape, meaning it could take years for a bow to be built. These enormous bows ranged from 1.87 to 2.11 meters, and they had a draw force of 670 to 710 newtons, which means it would require a 70 kilogram weight hanging from the bow to draw it to full strength. Demand for longbows caused a large yew tree shortage in England and Wales, and in 1472 a law was passed that every ship arriving into England had to bring 4 yew bows for roughly every 900 litres of other cargo. It was later increased to 10 yew bows for every 900 litres of cargo. Boys as young as 7 would begin training on smaller bows to build strength. To master a longbow it would take years, and these years would often physically alter the skeletons of archers. The strong left arm holding the bow would become longer, and bony projections would appear on the joints called osteophytes. Multiple English monarchs passed laws promoting archery. At times between the 14th and 17th centuries, it was mandatory after church, and football was banned to encourage archery. Archery practice fields were set up at 200 metres, although many archers could fire up to 300 metres. It has even been suggested that the archers of Edward III could fire 400 yards, 370 metres. However, at these extreme ranges, the infamous armour-piercing abilities of the English longbow would be greatly diminished. There are many battlefield reports of archers allowing their enemy to get well within range before firing. Archers were most effective behind a defensive position, often a trench or a row of wooden stakes. Their arrows would be stabbed into the ground in front of them ready to fire. The longbowmen even developed distinct types of arrowheads for different foes. The bodkin arrow had a long point that could pierce the armour of mounted knights, whereas barbed arrows were used on enemies without metal armour. Modern testing has proved that a well-crafted breastplate could withstand a direct hit from a bodkin arrow. However, many of the knights would have been wearing poorer quality suits of armour, with weaker steel and wider gaps that an arrow could punch through. Almost all knights rode into battle on armourless horses, which if hit by an arrow may throw their rider off at great speed and possibly crush them. In the war against the Welsh, one of the men of arms was struck by an arrow shot at him by a Welshman. It went right through his thigh, high up, where it was protected inside and outside by his iron shouse, and then through the skirt of his leather tunic. Next, it penetrated that part of the saddle, and finally, it lodged in his horse, driving so deep that it killed the animal.
The longbow was the pinnacle of military technology for a huge period of the 100 Years' War. This was best demonstrated during the Battle of Crecy, which took place in August 1346. This battle saw around 12,000 English belligerents defeat up to 30,000 French belligerents. The longbow was used to decimate both cavalry and French crossbowmen. Under Edward III, longbowmen were intelligently used. The arrows from longbows had a much greater range than the bolts from crossbows. This allowed the crossbowmen to be easily picked off from range when they rushed out to battle. Behind the crossbowmen were the French cavalry. A combination of being hit by flurries of arrows and the chaos caused by the defeated crossbowmen caused the horses to behave erratically and throw off the knights who rode them. Lobel observed that the arrows from the longbowmen caused some horses to leap into the air as if maddened. At the end of the day, there were at least 4,000 French casualties, whereas some report the English suffered as little as 40. We couldn't talk about the 100 Years' War without mentioning the most famous battle, Agincourt, which took place in October 1415. During this battle, almost 80% of Henry V's army consisted of longbowmen. The French clearly did not learn from Crecy, as their cavalry once again charged the English. They were outflanked by the longbow archers, and the arrows cut through the French cavalry. A monk from St. Denis provided a report which mentioned that the injured and panicking horses ended up trampling the French infantry. The surviving French infantrymen who reached the English line were then pushed back by the English longbowmen. This crushing defeat of the French by Henry V's forces was immortalised by becoming the centrepiece of Shakespeare's play, Henry V. The English longbow remained one of the most effective weapons on a medieval battlefield for centuries and was a brilliant counter to the previously unstoppable heavy cavalry charge. However, changes in technology meant that the longbow soon lost its efficacy. The Battle of Verneuil in August 1424 saw the English being overrun by the French. The longbow's arrows were no longer effective against the cavalry charges, as the men and horses were equipped with high-quality Milanese armour, which saw the arrows do minimal damage. The introduction of gunpowder weapons, which were able to pierce armour more effectively in the mid-15th century, meant that the use of the longbow declined. In 1450, at the Battle of Formigny, the French used heavy cannon fire to overwhelm and defeat the English. With the spreading of the musket in the early 16th century, the days of the longbow were over. The longbow had better range and accuracy than early muskets. However, it could take up to a decade to master the longbow, whereas the musket could be mastered in 6 months. Because of this and its armour-piercing abilities, medieval kings chose the musket. The last recorded use of the longbow was in 1642 during the English Civil War, when a longbowman militia defeated a group of musketeers. After the English Civil War, no army again would fight with the English longbow. The last hurrah of this weapon would come in World War II, when an eccentric British soldier named Jack Churchill stormed the Normandy beaches with bagpipes, a longsword, and a longbow. Longbow archers trained from boyhood were able to tear down what were once invincible cavalry charges. However, their supremacy on the medieval battlefield was ended by the gunpowder weapons that would dominate the late Middle Ages.